He promised her a fake marriage. 3 months later, someone was dead. Alexander Vance, a man whose name could move markets, thought he could turn love into leverage. He believed that emotions were tools, hearts were contracts, and people were currency. And for a while, he was right, until the woman he used decided to stop playing by his rules. In the skyscrapers he built, power was worshipped like a religion. Behind those mirrored windows, fortunes were traded, secrets buried, and one dangerous idea took root, that love could be manufactured, like profit. Her name was Elena Morales, an architect with dreams bigger than her bank account. He offered her a deal, a marriage on paper, a partnership in public. She said no until her family's survival hung in the balance. But here's the thing about pretending to love someone. Sometimes the act becomes real. And when it does, the truth becomes deadly. As their story unfolded, desire blurred into deception, control turned into confession, and every lie came with a price. Because in Alexander Vance's world, love wasn't an emotion, it was a weapon. And when you aim love at the wrong heart, someone always bleeds. If love begins as manipulation, does it ever stop being one?
Before we get into the story, kindly let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, please like the video so other people just like you can find this video too. Now let's get into it. In the archives of power, names like Alexander Vance carry a certain gravity. To the world, he was a symbol of triumph, the man who turned concrete and glass into gold. But beneath the marble floors of his empire, cracks were already forming. Investigators whispered his name in corridors lined with sealed evidence. Insider trading, market manipulation, deals buried under layers of legality. His image, the smiling billionaire, philanthropist, the face of progress, had begun to rot from the inside. In the boardrooms of Vance Global, silence became strategy. His legal team, a wall of precision and panic, devised a plan not to fix his crimes, but to hide them in plain sight. Their solution was simple, almost poetic. A distraction so dazzling it would make the world forget the dirt beneath his hands. A wedding. A perfect marriage. A love story scripted for cameras and headlines. Something wholesome to cleanse the air of suspicion. But love doesn't grow in boardrooms. It's manufactured, just like everything else he owned. And that's when fate placed Elena Morales in his path. She wasn't a celebrity nor a socialite. She was an architect, young, focused, with eyes that saw beauty where others saw blueprints. It was her design that had given his empire its crown jewel, the Horizon Tower, a building meant to reach the heavens. She didn't know it yet, but she had already built the foundation of his next lie. Alexander saw in her something the public would believe: humility, sincerity, innocence, the kind of woman who could humanize a monster without even realizing it. When his lawyers approached her with the proposal, she laughed. A fake marriage to a billionaire under federal investigation. It sounded absurd, until her father's construction firm, Morales & Sons, suddenly found itself blacklisted from every major contract in the city. Their machines stopped running, their workers went home, their debts began to grow like vines around their family's neck. And one quiet evening, when the phone stopped ringing and the house fell silent, she understood this wasn't coincidence. It was leverage. The next morning, she walked into Vance Global's headquarters, carrying the only thing she had left, her pride, and placed it on the negotiation table. He didn't smile. He didn't have to. The deal was already written long before she arrived. In exchange for her signature, her father's company would rise again, their debts erased, their future secured. It was a simple transaction, a business arrangement. But in Alexander's world, every transaction comes with interest. And for Elena Morales, the cost would be far greater than she could ever imagine.
Every lie begins to sound like truth if it's repeated often enough. For months, the illusion held. The photos looked real, the smiles effortless. But have you ever looked at a picture and sensed something missing? Something carefully edited out? Late night calls that stopped the moment she entered the room, locked drawers in his private office, numbers on ledgers that didn't align. Little things, harmless, until they weren't. Alexander began to change. His words became brief, his eyes distant. It wasn't neglect, it was strategy. And then came the discovery. Her brother, Matteo, wasn't a man of numbers. He worked with his hands, built what others only imagined. But when he opened the accounts for his father's company, he found projects that didn't exist and money that shouldn't be there. Where was it coming from? Who was signing these transfers in her name? When he brought the evidence to her, Elena wanted to believe there was a mistake. But the mistake was believing Alexander ever needed saving. He wasn't rescuing her family. He was burying them under his empire. Those contracts her father celebrated, they weren't lifelines, they were cover-ups. Her marriage certificate, the one that made her Mrs. Vance, was more than symbolic. It was structural. Her name wasn't just beside his in love, it was beneath his in crime. Every signature she placed became another stone in the wall he was building around her, slowly, deliberately, perfectly legal. Tell me what you would do if you found out your wedding ring was part of a money laundering scheme. Would you confront the man who gave it to you or pretend you never noticed? She confronted him, but Alexander didn't shout. He didn't deny. He simply looked at her, calm, silent, as if she was the one exposing a secret that should have stayed buried. In that silence, she understood. She wasn't his wife. She was his shield. Her life had been rewritten in legal ink. Her love turned into currency. Every kiss became another receipt for a crime she never agreed to commit. And in that moment, she realized something chilling. Power doesn't need to threaten you to control you. It only needs you to love the person holding the leash.
Truth has a sound. Quiet at first, like a whisper through glass, but once it starts, it never stops echoing. When Elena brought the truth home, it wasn't to seek comfort, it was to confess. Her family had been living inside Alexander's web, unaware they were part of its design. Her father listened in silence as she laid out the documents, the bank transfers, the falsified contracts, the hidden accounts. Every number was a dagger pointed at their name. He had built his company on sweat and cement, not schemes and laundering. To see it reduced to a front broke something in him. His hand shook. His breathing grew shallow. His empire and his pride crumbled in the span of one conversation. Her mother tried to stay calm, but mothers always know when the storm has already arrived. She turned to Elena and said, "End it tonight." But how do you end a deal that was never yours to begin with? How do you walk away from someone who owns the air you breathe? Elena tried. She packed her things, ready to vanish from the marble prison she once called home. But before she could leave, Alexander arrived. His eyes, once cold, were wild now, cornered. He knew the truth was leaking. Investors were calling, the press was circling, his empire was bleeding from every direction, and the one person who could expose him completely was standing in front of him, trembling, furious, free. He begged her to stay, said he'd fix it all, said he'd make it right. But his words were just smoke rising from a fire he could no longer control. Let me ask you something. When a liar starts to cry, do you hear pain or panic? That night, the Vance Foundation held its annual charity gala. Cameras, champagne, applause, the illusion of perfection. Elena arrived in silence. No smile, no statement, just the look of a woman who had stopped believing in stories. When Alexander raised his glass to toast their partnership, she stepped forward, and in front of his investors, his partners, the people who measured worth in billions, she took out the marriage certificate, the document that had chained her to his crimes, and tore it in half. The room froze. Cameras flashed. No one spoke. The sound of paper ripping through Simon's was louder than any scream. Alexander didn't move. He didn't chase her. He just watched as everything he'd built began to fracture under the weight of one woman's truth. By morning, the retaliation came. Her father's company terminated, all contracts void, equipment repossessed, workers dismissed without notice. That evening, as Elena sat beside her father, explaining that they would start again, he clutched his chest and never finished his sentence. The man who built foundations for others couldn't withstand the collapse of his own. Tell me, what do you do when justice comes dressed as grief? When the price of freedom is the life of someone you swore to protect? In the silence that followed, Alexander Vance, the man who once controlled everything, finally understood what it meant to lose something he couldn't buy back. For the first time, he wasn't the author of the story. He was the consequence. And as Elena stood at her father's grave days later, she realized the cruel symmetry of it all. She had married a man to save her family and lost her family because she married him. How much forgiveness can exist in a heart that's already buried under ruin?
Every empire ends the same way. Quietly at first, then all at once. For years, Alexander Vance had ruled the skyline of glass and steel. Now, those same towers reflected headlines he couldn't control. Investigations, indictments, arrests. His partners, his advisors, one by one, they turned on him, trading loyalty for leniency. The empire that once seemed indestructible began to collapse under its own secrets. And in the middle of it all, the woman who had once been his alibi was gone. Elena disappeared. Without warning, no press statement, no farewell. She returned to the town she once called home, a place small enough to forget her name, but never her story. Her mother, fragile from grief, leaned on her as they tried to rebuild what was left. Some nights, Elena would wake to the sound of her mother crying.
Other nights to the echo of her father's laughter in her dreams. Guilt had a way of staying, even when love didn't. Meanwhile, Alexander was drowning in the very silence he once demanded. He spent his days inside an empty penthouse, curtains drawn, waiting for the next call from his lawyers, from the authorities, from anyone who still remembered him as something other than a cautionary tale. But no one called. The markets turned, investors withdrew, his fortune, his friends, his face, all vanished from the front pages that had once worshipped him. Tell me, have you ever watched someone powerful lose everything? Do they crumble, or do they cling harder to the illusion that power still exists? Alexander clung. He denied the charges, blamed the system, accused his own board of betrayal. But the truth didn't need him anymore. It had witnesses, evidence, and a trail of signatures that led straight to his name. And when the warrants came, he was no longer the man who commanded rooms. He was a ghost wearing a suit, escorted through hallways by men who didn't look him in the eye. For the cameras outside the courthouse, he stayed silent. No statements, no apologies, only that same stoic expression, a mask finally cracking from within. Weeks turned into months. His assets were frozen, his company dismantled. The city he built turned its lights away from him. Rumors whispered that Alexander Vance had fled the country, a man too proud to face what remained of his life. But whispers are never the full story, because somewhere in a quiet town, far from the headlines, a letter arrived at a local school. It contained a check, no return address, no name, funding a scholarship in honor of a man called Gabriel Morales, Elena's father. The letter simply read, "For those who build dreams for others." There was no signature, only a familiar handwriting, steady and sharp. So the question remains, was it guilt or love that drove him to send it? Does redemption still count when no one knows it was you who sowed it? For Alexander Vance, the world had moved on. His name erased, his empire gone, but guilt has a longer lifespan than memory. And love, even when broken, has a way of echoing long after the walls have fallen. Sometimes the most haunting apology is the one whispered in secret.
Time doesn't heal, it hides. 2 years had passed since the empire fell. 2 years since the name Alexander Vance became a warning instead of a legacy. In those years, Elena found the life that asked for nothing but honesty. She taught architecture at a small-town school, sketching blueprints on chalkboards instead of skyline glass. Her students never asked about her past, and she never told them. Every morning, she walked the same route her father once took to work. The air smelled of dust and rain. For the first time in years, she could breathe without permission. Her mother's grief had softened into quiet strength. They spoke of simple things, dinner, students,
the changing of the seasons, and avoided the name that still hung in the corners of their silence. Then, one winter afternoon, as the sky dimmed to silver, a figure appeared outside the classroom window. Thin, pale, unfamiliar, yet unmistakable. Alexander Vance had returned. He wasn't the man the world remembered. The suits were gone, the arrogance stripped away. His frame was smaller, his face hollow, the kind of face that carried years and days. He waited until the final student left, then stood in the doorway, hesitant, as though crossing it might collapse him completely. Tell me, what would you do if the person who destroyed your life suddenly walked back into it? Would you listen, or would you close the door before they spoke? Elena didn't speak. Neither did he. The air between them was thick with everything that hadn't been said. Love, guilt, and the ghost of every choice that brought them there. Finally, he broke the silence. He told her he had turned himself in, that the scholarship in her father's name was his doing, that he hadn't fled to escape punishment, he'd fled to face himself. He confessed that he'd spent every night in prison writing letters he never sent, trying to explain why he did what he did. And then the words that broke through the last of her anger. Your father's death wasn't just my doing. It was my awakening. He told her about his sister, the secret no one knew. A child born with a rare illness, hidden from the press, from investors, from a world that only celebrated strength. His crimes had started years before Elena ever walked into his life. Embezzlements disguised as mergers, funds diverted from projects, all to keep his sister alive in a private facility overseas. He said he believed compassion was weakness, that love was a liability, and that every lie he ever told was an attempt to control what he feared most, losing someone he couldn't replace. He looked at her and said, "You were never part of the plan, but you became the consequence I needed." For the first time, she saw him not as a monster, not as a tycoon, but a man who had built his own prison long before the bars were visible. When a man admits every sin, do you see repentance or performance? Do you forgive because he's sorry, or because you want to believe he finally feels something real? Elena said nothing. She simply turned to the window where the sun was fading behind the hills and whispered the words her mother once said. Contracts signed in fear always end in pain. Alexander nodded. Then let this be the first thing I sign without fear. He placed a single envelope on her desk. Inside, the deed to her father's company, fully restored, debts cleared, ownership returned to her name. No signatures, no clauses, no traps. For the first time, he left something behind that didn't come with the price. As he walked away, the door closing softly behind him, she didn't stop him. Forgiveness is rarely loud. Sometimes it's just the decision not to hate anymore. So tell me,
when a man breaks the world and then tries to rebuild a piece of it, does that make him human again?
The past doesn't rest just because you've made peace with it. Sometimes it waits, silent, patient, until the moment you think you've survived it. Days after Alexander's visit, Elena's mother called her into the living room. There was a letter, old, yellowed, tucked inside the pages of a book her father used to read. It was written in his handwriting, the same neat script that used to sign school permission slips, birthday cards, and paychecks. But this time, the ink carried something else, a confession. In the letter, her father admitted that he'd known about Alexander's crimes long before the marriage, that the deals which saved their company had been built on money they were never meant to touch. He hadn't been a victim. He'd been a participant. He wrote about the fear of losing everything, the shame of weakness, the hope that one day he could fix what he'd helped corrupt. But he never got the chance. The night he collapsed, it wasn't betrayal that killed him. It was guilt. So tell me, what hurts more? Discovering that the person you loved lied to you, or realizing they were lying to themselves the whole time? For Elena, every memory began to blur. The father she defended, the man she thought Alexander destroyed, had already sold his integrity long before she signed that marriage contract. Suddenly, the story she had lived for years of innocence versus greed, of villain and victim, crumbled beneath its own simplicity. Alexander hadn't destroyed her family. He had exposed what was already dying beneath the surface. The empire, the marriage, the tragedy, all of it had been built on a foundation that was never clean to begin with. And for the first time, Elena realized that everyone she had loved had been living behind a mask. Her father's silence, her mother's warnings, Alexander's manipulation, each one a different shade of the same truth. People will do anything to protect what they love, even if it means bearing what's right. She sat there, the letter trembling in her hands, listening to the rain outside as if it could wash away the weight of those words. But rain doesn't cleanse guilt. It only makes the stains visible. So, what do you do when the truth doesn't set you free? It traps you deeper. Elena folded the letter and placed it back inside the book, her hand steady, but her soul in ruins. For years, she'd blamed one man for her suffering. Now she didn't know who deserved forgiveness, or if forgiveness was even the right word anymore. Because how do you forgive a world where every act of love was built on a lie? Some say the truth heals. Others say it destroys. But maybe it simply reveals what was always there, the cracks we refused to see until the light finally found them. And as Elena stood by the window that night, watching the lights flicker across the small town, she whispered to herself, maybe he wasn't the only one pretending.
Rain has a way of softening everything, even the sharpest memories. On a quiet morning, beneath the sky the color of ash, Elena walked down the gravel path to the grave that bore her father's name. The flowers were wilted, the air thick with silence. She wasn't sure why she came, maybe to find peace, or maybe to finally let go of the story that had followed her for years. She wasn't alone. Alexander was already there, kneeling in the rain. The same man who once commanded empires now looked small against the weight of the world he tried to control. His hands trembled as he brushed the water from the headstone, as if erasing years of guilt could be done with a gesture that simple. He didn't look at her right away. When he finally did, his voice was quiet,
the kind of voice that comes after a lifetime of speaking too loudly. I faked a marriage to protect myself. I never thought it would make me wish for something real. No apology, no justification, just a sentence heavy enough to break the air between them. Elena didn't answer. She simply reached into her pocket and pulled out her father's old wedding ring, the same one she used to spin on the kitchen table as a child. The metal was dull, the engraving worn, but it carried everything that had ever mattered to her: love, loyalty, and loss. She placed it gently on the headstone. No words, no closure, just the quiet exchange between two people who finally understood that some moons don't heal, they settle. Tell me, is forgiveness something you give to others, or something you offer to yourself when there's nothing left to say? Alexander's eyes followed her as she turned and began to walk away. No music played, no reconciliation, just the sound of rain against the earth and a man who had ran out of places to hide. Behind her, he knelt once more, alone now, and whispered the only truth he had left. Forgiveness isn't owed, it's earned. The world around them washed in gray. Two lives forever linked, not by love, but by the price of it.
Some stories don't end when the final words are spoken. They echo. Weeks passed after that rainy morning. The ring Elena left on her father's grave remained untouched, the metal darkened by weather and time. But each drop of rain that hit it carried something unseen, a piece of two broken souls learning at last to exist without pretending. Elena continued to teach. She never spoke of him again. Yet sometimes, when her students asked why she always designed buildings with open roofs, she'd smile faintly and say, "Because some stories need space for the light to get in." As for Alexander, his name never reappeared in the papers. No sightings, no interviews. Just rumors of a man living quietly near the coast, restoring a forgotten chapel stone by stone. Maybe he was rebuilding more than a wall. Maybe he was rebuilding himself. So I'll ask you one final time. When love burns everything it touches, and still you find yourself wishing for its warmth, is that weakness or proof that the heart never learns? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I really want to hear your take on this one. And if the story moved you, if you felt even a glimpse of truth in their pain, please take a moment to like this video. It helps more people like you discover stories that remind us what it means to feel. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just be the one that stays with you forever. This was Millionaire Love Tales by Catherine, where hearts remember what money forgets.